Hello, my name's Grandmaster Daniel Gormally, and welcome back to my series on how to calculate. So this is part 4 of the series. Today I'm going to be looking at a game I played recently against a strong Scottish Grandmaster, Colin McNabb. And Colin is sort of a well-known, experienced international player. He doesn't really play much anymore, so I kind of had a sort of advantage because I felt during the game I felt slightly sharper than Colin because I played a lot of blitz chess lately, whereas Colin just doesn't really play much. So, you know, it kind of played into my hands a bit. The reason I want to discuss this game is because I want to talk about how you can go very deep into a position. This is something that interests me, the idea that you can look beyond the obvious. And when I used to sort of follow chess when I was younger, a match that really stuck in my memory was the Garry Kasparov-Nigel Short match in 1993. Now, this is probably the match that really got me into chess, really inspired me to play chess for a living, you know, or basically inspired me to try and get better at chess. And one of the things that struck me during the match was how Kasparov would spend a lot of time in the opening, really going deep. So, generally speaking, when a position transitioned from the opening into the middle game, this is when Kasparov would spend a lot of time trying to go really deep into the position, trying to uncover the secrets of the position. And I do recall that Vishy Anand himself, who obviously has, you know, played a match against Kasparov only 2 years later in 1995, and has a vast experience of playing against Kasparov, said that Kasparov was famous for going very deep into a particular line. Now, the advantage of that method of calculation is quite obvious. For one thing, you don't get bogged down in sub-variations because you're just looking at one particular line. Secondly, you know, you tend to, because you're going so deep into the position, you tend to pick up sort of like hidden secrets about the position, which can help you further down the line. So if your opponent deviates from your main line, that's fine, because you've gone deep into the position, you've picked up a lot of interesting information about the particular position that you're playing. So, to give you an example, I reached this position against Colin, and my attempt to go deep into the position here was with the move at A4. This is what I really tried to analyse. Of course, compared to Kasparov, you know, my attempts were probably quite pitiful. But if we look, I mean, basically, the move I played in the game was d takes e5. And the reason I played d takes e5 was, even though I analysed a4 more extensively, I wasn't able to come to a conclusive and sort of verdict on the move a4. I wasn't certain whether it would give me any advantage or not. So after a4, black, the move that I was afraid of was simply going a4, b4, sorry. And after knight e2, he plays the move e takes d4. Now, it's also worth looking at a couple of alternatives. For example, he can play d5, immediately counter-attacking in the centre, which is in some ways can be quite a useful move, because I have to be careful. If I take on d5, he hits me with a move e4, forking the bishop on d3 and the knight on f3. So I have to be careful. But I did look at d5, and I was worried about that move until I saw the move knight g3. And then I realised, well, actually, everything's under control. I'm controlling the e4 square. My rook on e1 can become useful if the e-file ever gets opened up. Aim down at the queen on e7. So really, actually, this actually backfires against black because of the fact that I'm slightly more developed than he is. So d5 isn't a move that white needs to fear. Another possibility that black has is c5. But then white simply takes on e5. And after d takes e5, he plays the move, positional move, knight g3. Now, knight g3 is useful for a number of reasons. Firstly, it frees up the e2 square. Possibly white may want to play queen e2 at some point. And it also brings the knight closer to the black king. Now, you can't go to f5, but there may be variations later on that if, for example, white was to play bishop h6, he may have some ideas of playing knight f5. So that's one thing to bear in mind. And the other thing is, which is a very important factor, is that the white pawn on e4 is now protected or overprotected. Now this is a theme that Aaron Nimzowitsch famously described in his very famous book, My System, called Overprotection, which I think is a very useful theme. Hopefully I can go into this in future videos. But basically the idea of overprotection is that you free your pieces. So for example, now this bishop on d3 is not so tied down to protection of e4. So that's a very useful concept. But basically I realised that white was doing fine in this position after bishop b7, a5. White is better here, I would say, because the pawn on c5 is a potential target. If black could possibly play a move like c4, but then after bishop takes c4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, he runs into trouble after bishop g5. So that's fine for white. But of course, going back, the move that I was really afraid of, and I was less than sure about, was if he simply took on d4. Now, I go knight e takes d4. And now he's got a couple of choices. He can play bishop b7, or he can play the move c5. Now, both moves, when I was trying to analyse this at the board, before playing the move a4, or d takes e5, which I eventually plumped for, trying to analyse this position, I was less than certain about. I thought, you know, okay, I go knight c6, he goes queen e8, I go bishop f4, he goes knight b6, I go knight a5, possibly I'm better. But then I thought, well, what happens if he plays, after knight c6, what happens if he plays queen e6 first? And then after knight g5, then play queen e8. You know, so there's a lot to analyse, because it's a very sharp sort of middle game position. But I just wasn't sure about it. And going back, the other problem is that black also has the move bishop b7, which I wasn't sure about either. Now I take on b4, so I don't have to worry about c5 now because of queen b7. But after I take on b4, he plays rook a b8, preparing to move c5 as he's now protecting the bishop. I play queen a3, he plays c5, I play knight b5, knight takes e4, bishop g5, queen e6, bishop takes e4, takes knight d2, which initially looks very good for white, but then you see that after d5, it's not so clear, because if I play a move like f3, he may be able to hit the bishop with queen f5. All these lines are very murky, and gradually I sort of like got the impression that my opponent would be more comfortable with this variation. That if I played a4, it would rather play into Colin's hands. Now, I know Colin is a player who also likes clarity. He likes a position which is simplified. He's a very good endgame player. But at the same time, I didn't really feel comfortable in this position as white. I felt that black had just as much counter-attacking chances as white. So, eventually, I opted for the move d takes e5. Again, this is a question of process of elimination. You know, often you play lines because you're looking for clarity, or you know, like I say, the reason I didn't play a4 is because I just felt it was too murky. Whereas here I can just get a clear advantage without any risk. Well, not a clear advantage, but I'm slightly better without any risk. So after d takes e5, he took with a knight. He could have taken a pawn, of course, which was perfectly reasonable. I would probably continue in the same way with a4, b4, knight e2. But now you see he doesn't have this possibility of taking on d4 and then somehow creating something in the centre, which he did in the other line. So this is a simpler line for white. I don't have to calculate quite so many variations. And I think that's always that's always the case in your games, that you should really be looking for clarity. You should really be looking, if you have a choice between a line where you're slightly better without any risk, or where you could be a lot better but there's far more risk, I think you should opt for the first line from a practical point of view. So he took with a knight. I took. He took with a pawn. I went a4. He went b4, and I went knight e2. He played rook d8. Now, in these sort of positions, I was thinking about, because, possibly opting for the move bishop h6. Possibly not in this position, because it does give him the possibility of knight takes e4. In fact, it would be a blunder here. But actually, if we go back a couple of moves, I could have played bishop h6 here. There was another possibility. But as I was analysing a lot of these variations, it occurred to me that actually the bishop h6 didn't really gain a lot. It's very hard for me to gain a kingside attack. His king is very solid. And also, I realised that the bishop is actually very useful on e3, because if we go to the position that we got in the game, after rook d8, the bishop on e3 actually controls a lot of useful squares on the queen side. It controls c5, it potentially aims at a7. Whereas if you go bishop h6, I think you're giving up the bishop too cheaply. So I went knight g3. Yeah, so there are of course ideas of going bishop h6 later that black has to be careful about. But I do think, and I think that's another interesting point, that when you start analysing the position of the board, you often see far more into the game than you do in preparation. Now in preparation, I'd probably looking at all these lines with bishop h6. But when I was actually sitting at the board and I was actually analysing a lot more lines than I probably would do in preparation, because you're far more focused during a competitive game. I think you see far more into the position. And, this is where I sort of realised that actually you gain more knowledge through competitive play. Because you're more sort of zoned in, if you will. It's like, I play, occasionally I play quizzes, like pub quizzes. And, it's one thing, you can sit at home, you can read all these quiz books, but you forget them all. But when you're actually doing a pub quiz, and it's under competitive, sort of, under a competitive, sort of time frame, then you're far more likely to remember the answers that you get wrong than if you sat at home reading a book. And I think it's exactly the same in chess, that when you're actually playing in a competitive environment, you're far more likely to remember. You're far more likely to improve, really, than you are if you're sat at home reading lots of chess books and trying to learn as much information as possible. So I say to all my students, the main thing you must remember is to play a lot of chess. Anyway, I digress. Let's get on with the game. So he went bishop e6, very solid move. I went a5, which is a useful move because it potentially, I want to go a6 and really tie him down to this weakness and maybe get ready for the endgame. I think at this moment, though, objectively, the position is just completely equal. Black's completely solid. Doesn't really have any great deal of problems. It's just a position. It's just a game. And he went knight e8. I'm not sure about that move. I went queen e2, and he went bishop f8. Now, I sort of got the impression over the next few moves, because I went knight f1. Well, immediately I was drawn towards the move f4. But the problem with f4 is he takes, I take, and I went queen f6. So again, it's process of elimination. I can eliminate this line with f4 because as soon as I reach the position after queen f6, it's quite clear that black is doing well. The bishop on f4 is getting hit and the pawn on b2 is also under attack. And if I have to make a move like bishop c1, then I can hardly claim to be better. So it was quite clear that f4 was not a good move. But I played knight f1. Now this move might look strange. You might think, well, the knight on g3 is perfectly well placed. But it's not really doing a great deal. If we could just go back, actually the knight on g3, like I say, in some lines the knight might be useful for a kingside attack, but at the moment I don't really have any threats on the kingside. Now I can't go to f5, and I can't go to h5. So often in these positions, the knight on g3, when black has a pawn on g6, the knight on g3 is actually a very bad piece. So it's a good idea. So what you should always be doing when you're playing chess is looking to relocate your pieces, you know, to potentially better squares. I mean, a player like Karpov was famous for I remember he had a game against Boris Spassky, a very famous game where he played a maneuver knight b1 to d2, and then he brought the knight round to f3, and gradually Spassky's position fell apart. And Aaron Nimzovich had a very famous game, I think, where he played the move knight g1. So often these knight maneuvers, when the position's closed, like in this position where there's not much going on, you have this time to bring the knight round into play. So I went knight f1, he went knight c7, I went knight d2, makes perfect sense. I bring either the knight round to c4 potentially, or maybe they just bring the knight round to f3. He went f6. And this is where really, you know, I mean, there are situations in chess where I think you should analyse deeply, and I think there's some situations which basically just call for you playing a move on field. Now, at this point I went f4. I couldn't possibly analyse all the consequences of f4 correctly. Chess is too deep a game. You can't sit there and spend hours on every move because you'll simply lose on time. Some moves you just have to play with feel, and this was a good example. f4 just looked so natural. The position was crying out for f4. I wasn't particularly impressed with my opponent's last few moves. They looked too passive. I didn't like the move f6. And I sort of felt my opponent was out of form, and I felt this is the moment to really put him under pressure, try and open up some lines. He took, I took with the bishop. He played knight b5, I went e5, he went f5, I went queen f2. Yeah, and this is a really key moment in the game, because I think the interesting thing here was I was analysing his position at the board, and I think my opponent basically suffered from the same poor calculation, because I'm sure he would have normally gone for the move queen c5, and I said before, Colin's a very good endgame player. And he's also probably aware that I've got this reputation as an attacking player. He wants to get the queens off anyway. So queen c5 looked very natural. Now the problem is that what do you do after the move bishop e3? You're kind of obliged, unless you passively go back to e7, where you just, after queen e7, white can simply play knight f3. You're kind of obliged to take this pawn on e5. Now, I'm sure we both got to this position in our calculation. And I remember actually analysing the board, and I thought, well, you know, surely bishop g5 is very strong. Now, the interesting thing is, I put this on my computer after the game, and it actually gave black a slight advantage in this position. You think, well, bishop g5 is surely just crushing. You know, you're attacking d8, you're hitting the queen on e5. The bishop on e6 is also possibly under threat if the queen moves away. Surely this is just crushing. But no, black has a very strong move in this position. And I actually showed this position to a student of mine, a sort of 10-year-old kid from Seattle called Jason Zhang. I think he's 10 or 11 or something like this. And I thought, well, this is a very hard puzzle, you know, only the computer can find it. And he immediately said, oh, what about queen takes b2? Which is also the move that the computer comes up with. So this is a move I completely overlooked in my calculations. And after bishop takes d8, rook takes d8, rook a b1. Black again has a very strong move here, rather than passively coming back to f6. Well, in fact, this may well allow a very strong idea. Black has another very nice idea here. He can play queen c3. And the point is the bishop is taboo, because after rook takes e6, runs into bishop c5. So this actually turns out to be quite good for black. Not winning for black by any stretch of the imagination. You know, after queen c3, maybe I can move my king. But if anyone's better here as black, he's got 2 pawns for an exchange. His pieces are very active. I have weaknesses on my dark squares. But I think the interesting thing about this variation in general is just the fact that neither of us were able to go far enough. And I think, again, it demonstrates why sometimes you need to go that little bit further, you know. The whole line is really rather forced. You know, neither player can really deviate in this line. So those are the sort of lines where you should be looking to go further. When you feel comfortable that you know exactly what's going on. As I said before in the previous video, you want to be careful that you don't go analyse too many long lines where you're missing stuff earlier on in the game. But if you feel confident about the position, you feel confident that it's a forcing line, then by all means go that little bit further. So this would have worked out well for black. But my opponent didn't play Queen C5. He played a move Knight D4, which wasn't a bad move, but in a practical sense, it wasn't a good move because he was getting short of time. And this movement allowed me to keep the queens on. Whereas Queen C5 would have practically forced me to exchange queens. As I said, that line with Bishop E3 doesn't turn out very well for white. So Knight D4. I went Bishop E3. He went C5. I went Knight C4. He played Queen F7. I went Knight D6. Bishop takes, Pawn takes, Rook takes, Bishop F4. So here we got this position. I thought, I suddenly started feeling very comfortable. I thought, well, surely I'm doing very well here. You know, I'm getting the dark square. I mean, I'm a pawn down, but I'm getting these dark squares. And I thought that was fantastic compensation because as we see these dark squares around the black king. Now his dark square bishop has been exchanged. These dark squares around the black king are very vulnerable. If I ever line a bishop up on E5 or a bishop on H6, suddenly becomes a very powerful piece. So I felt very comfortable here, but objectively speaking, black is at least equal here. He went Rook D7, I went Rook D1. And that, yeah, again we come to a critical moment. He played the move Bishop D5. A better try was to play the move Bishop C4. This is the move that worried me during the game. Now, after Bishop takes, Queen takes, white has to move Rook D3. Now, the simple way to be better for black, actually, well, probably to be better, is to play the move Rook F7. The Knight on D4 is very strong. Yes, there are potential possibilities of white playing Bishop H6 and maybe gaining some kind of attack, but then he also has to be careful about his C2 pawn now. So, you know, it's not so straightforward for white. And I think Rook F7 would really have been comfortable for black. I don't think he'd have had any problems whatsoever, and maybe he can even push for the win himself. But it's interesting actually, the computer, when I put this position on the computer engine, it came up with a move Queen A2. Now, I was putting this, you know, I wasn't putting this game on something like Komodo or something. I was just putting it on the default engine on ChessBase. Initially it said, well, Queen A2 is just very, very good for black. You know, this is like a typical computer move. No human in this position would really play a move like Queen A2. They'd think, well, it just looks silly. But after Queen A2, white plays Rook E3. And after Queen B2, white plays Queen H4. Now, once you put this position on the same computer, suddenly it changes its evaluation. And suddenly it realises that white has a winning attack. Now, as I've said before, this is a weak computer. Now, a stronger computer would realise straight away that probably that Queen A2 is not a very good move. But, yeah, it's interesting that it changes its evaluation when it starts going deep in the position. And I think that, again, that demonstrates the fact that white has this long-term compensation in an attacking sense because of these weakened squares around the black king. The computer only takes some time to actually realise this. But yeah, I mean, basically the queen is very well placed on c4. Why move it? But yeah, in general, bishop c4 seemed like the right way to go. Exchange off one of white's assets, which is the two bishops. But he didn't do that. He played bishop d5, which probably wasn't a terrible move. I went c3, he took. He went knight e6, I went bishop b5, rook d8. I went bishop h6, he went rook b8. And again, this is a critical position. Now, at the board, I'm sat here and I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute. The first move that I looked at was rook takes d5. And it was a move I really, really wanted to play, you know. I probably had about 20 minutes left at this point. Colin had about a minute. Now, bear in mind, there's also increments as well. So, I mean, having a minute isn't, you know, I mean, I've sat there often in games and you think your opponent's under time pressure, but these horrendous increments, you know, suddenly you go from, it looks like his flag's fallen or he's going to lose on time to he's suddenly back in the game and he's better and he's got loads of time on his clock and he's smashing you to pieces. So I really hate increments. And I'm not the only, you know, player that has that viewpoint. But basically the problem again, and the other problem is that even though I've got 20 minutes left, it's all on my time. So I'm having to think it. So I'm gradually eating into my time, and I see this possibility of rook takes d5. But again, it's a calculation issue. Can I be totally confident rook takes d5 is winning? In fact, it's the correct move. What I should do is rook takes d5. It's an absolute thunderbolt, and it basically just wins for white. So after rook takes d5, I go bishop c4. And probably the key defensive line is rook d8. And after queen e2. Now, when I was looking at this at the board, I only looked at the move queen a2, which actually fails because of the move rook d1. So I kind of stopped my analysis too quickly. But in fact, the problem is here for black is that he's really pinned horribly along this diagonal. So white can simply improve his position with a move queen e2. And this leaves black in all sorts of trouble. And after knight c7, white plays bishop f4, increasing the pressure even more. And after rook e8, the very subtle queen f1. And basically, black is really overloaded here. He cannot move the rook on d5. The knight on c7. If he moves the knight on c7, for example, well, I mean, I'm attacking the knight on c7, so I'm kind of overloading this knight on c7 and trying to break all these pins. So after knight a8, I can simply take on d5. It's not exactly clear what he does in this position. So basically, this line is winning, according to the computer, which I checked with later on. But seeing all this stuff at the board isn't easy, obviously. You know, you have to be absolutely certain. I thought if I take on d5, it's the move I instinctively want to play, but at the same time, I have to be certain that it's winning. You know, he could just peter out and I could just look silly, you know, I could just be an exchange down. Or he could just find a way to give back the exchange and equalise very easily. So I wanted to keep more tension in position. So I played the move queen h4. Now, when your opponent's short of time, like Colin was in this instance, I think it's generally a better idea not to go for forcing lines. It's a better idea to keep the tension in the position for as long as possible. Because when your opponent's short of time, the tendency is for them to calculate forcing lines. So Colin would have been calculating the line with rook takes d5. But queen h4 is more of a vague move. It's not exactly so clear what black's response should be. And this is why I was drawn towards the move queen h4. I've always had this tendency that when my opponent's in time trouble is to basically just try and just try and play tricky moves, and sometimes that can backfire because you end up playing a tricky move, and it turns out that you've tricked yourself. Okay, in this particular instance, I got lucky. He played g5. Bear in mind that he can't take on b5 because of the move rook takes d5. Sorry, because of the move rook takes e6. And this was the idea behind queen h4, sort of tactical idea. And if he takes the queen, I swoop down, and is more or less game over. It's going to be forced checkmate. Of course, yeah. And another possibility is bishop e4, trying to block the e file, but then I go bishop c4 and creating this really nasty pin again. So again, I'm a pawn down, but he's the one who's under tremendous pressure. And if he tries to launch a counter-attack here, it really gets stopped in its tracks after rook d8 check, where I've got basically forced checkmate. So, of course, Colin's a very resourceful player, and I realised that he would find the next move. As soon as I went Queen h4, I could sense he would find the next move. And of course he did. He played the move, he played the move g5, which is very nice, it was a very nice idea. And the reason behind g5 was that if I take on g5, he takes, and now he can go for this endgame with queen g7, because I don't have time to take on f5 because of the checkmate on g2. And then I suddenly I sat there and I suddenly thought, oh God, you know, have I really bungled this? When he went g5, I thought, oh, you know, have I messed this up? Because of this line with queen g7, which I'd missed. I thought, you know, the last thing I want is some lousy endgame. Okay, I can take on g5, and then, you know, maybe take, and then play something with c4 and rook e7, but I don't really want to play into some endgame where I might be slightly better, or maybe even slightly worse. If, well, I think there is some line I was looking at in the game with something like this, c4, regaining the piece. But I thought, well, no, you know, this just isn't right. You know, I'm attacking. His king is wide open. Do I really want to go for some lousy endgame where I'm a pawn up? Absolutely not. This is something I want to totally avoid. So of course I'm looking around for other ideas. So the first move I'm drawn towards is potentially to move queen a4. But then I thought, yes, that keeps the queen on, and maybe there's some idea after queen g6 of, you know, playing bishop c4. So it's going to be very hard for him to take on h6. Yeah, so g5. So the first move I was looking at was queen a4. And I thought, well, surely it's preferable to keep the queen closer towards the black king side. So that's why, by process of elimination, the first move I saw was queen a4. So often when you calculate, you come by moves by process of elimination or by the same logic. So my logic was to keep the queens on if I could, and keep the tactical tricks in the position. Of course, I didn't want to go queen a4 because it's too far away from the black king side. So eventually I settled on the move queen g3. And this is where he made a big mistake, because he should have played the move f4. Okay, let's just look at the variations here. Okay, firstly, let's look at the move queen c7. This I think is bad because I take and I go bishop takes g5. So the first move you can dismiss as black is bishop g7, because now black basically falls apart. If he goes rook d8, or rook d6 rather, I go bishop f4, and if he goes rook g6, I can take on c7, rook g2, king f1, rook b5, rook takes d5. Thank you very much, I'm a piece up. And this should certainly be winning for white. In fact, if he goes rook b2, I take on f5. So by process of elimination, we can see that queen c7 is not an adequate defence. But the move he should have played in this position was the move f4. Now, there's a very subtle reason why f4 is better than the move he played in the game. The point is that after queen g4, he takes yes. And now, if I play the way I played in the game with rook takes e6, which looks very strong, yes, she takes, goes queen g5, king f7, and after I take on d8, plays queen e3 check. This is the difference. Because the pawn's on f4, the black pawn's on f4, it's blocking the bishop on h6, so queen e3 now becomes a possibility. And in fact here, I think he's actually winning, because I can't defend g2. If I go to f1, he takes on h3, and if I go to h2, he plays queen g3 check. And similarly, if I play king f1, he plays bishop c4 check, which is completely crushing. So white has to be careful himself, because this f4 move creates certain counterplay. What I should play actually in this position is c4. And after rook b8, now I take on d5, f3, he's got a counter-attacking move, gf3, knight d4, queen g5. So I believe this is actually good for white. But okay, maybe you can continue with the move queen g6. So this is what I should play. But f4 is a far better yeah, there's another line actually. You can play f3 in this position, but then I take on e6. Now I can take, you see. This is a big difference, because after f2, king h2, queen e6, in fact I simply exchange queens, and then I'm winning. A very clever tactic, because if he queens the pawn, I play rook f8 check, winning the queen. And if he, he could knight the pawn, but then I go king g1, I'm winning on material. So basically, it's quite complicated, but what he should have played was f4. Now, but bear in mind that Colin's very short time at this moment. You know, so it's understandable that he didn't see all these. I mean, I didn't see any of these variations, you know. So, but maybe instinctively I may have found f4 over the board, possibly not. But he actually took on b5 here. Now I came up with this prepared idea, which was rook takes e6. Now it is indeed very strong for white. And after g4, the difference is, of course, that in the same variation we looked at earlier, now this is good for white, because he doesn't have this queen e3 resource. So just this slight subtle difference to the position makes all the difference. And if he takes on h6, well, I've got several ways of winning. Probably taking on d5 is good, but I can also simply play queen d7 and pick up the rook on b5. But anyway, yeah, Colin didn't play that. He actually played the move g4. And but now I suddenly realise, well, actually, he's kind of been taken aback my rook takes e6 move. So, you know, I took on g4. So I didn't take on g4, apparently. But actually, I probably would have been even stronger than the move I played. But what you often find in good positions, which this certainly is for white, he's got a very strong attack. There's more than one way to sort of skin a goose. So in this position, I believe I played the move queen h4. And after rook d7, I played queen g5, king h8. And I played rook f6. And Colin resigned. Because wherever he moves the queen to, for example, queen g8, I play rook f8. So he doesn't have a good square for the queen. If he plays queen e7, I play rook f8 check. So it's basically game over, and if bishop g8, I can take on g8. So really I'm winning because of these dark square weaknesses around the black king. So eventually they came back to haunt him, a bit like in some of the other games we've looked at. So just to sum up, you need to know what's going on in the first few moves in your calculation, but when you become accustomed to that, you can then go deeper. And when the line is more forcing, when you're confident that your opponent cannot deviate, it's a good idea to go down deep in one particular line, because the further you go down, the more you analyse that line, rather than getting sucked into all the different sub-variations. If you go deep down in one line, then you're going to pick up a lot about the position. You're going to penetrate very deep into the mysteries of the position.